I'm Jade, and today I'm going to talk about managing OCD at work, sharing some of my experiences with having severe OCD at work, talking to colleagues about it, or in my case, not talking to colleagues about it, some useful tips that I've picked up on my own recovery journey that could help you if you're currently struggling with managing OCD at work, and really just to talk about the different ways that I have found OCD manifests in work. So the first thing to say is that I'm 34 years old and I've been working on my recovery journey for the last 3 to 4 years since finding out that I had severe OCD. And I'm in a really great place today. And I'm interested in the topic of managing OCD at work because I recently received a question from someone in a similar line of work to me asking how I got through. Now, what's really interesting about my experience with work and OCD is that for me, work was a distraction, a little bit like gaming, I suppose. I found that I could lose myself in my work, and that helped me to escape my brain in many ways. And so what I found was I would tend towards work addiction and overworking because it was my safe place in many ways. So if my brain was busy with work, I found that my brain would let me off the hook with intrusive thoughts or any things that were coming up from an anxiety point of view, so I could get lost in my computer for hours. And even today, when I'm working, I really have to check in with myself and make sure that I'm not going back to that place of just like compulsively working. I have to make sure that I'm getting a good balance when I'm working and that I take regular breaks and just work in a more healthy way. Now, when I say this, I mean I only currently work 1.5 days a week due to having small children. So I just mean while in the flow of work, it's really important for me to take breaks and things like that. The other element of OCD and how it manifests at work is where we really don't want to be in work and we feel really triggered by work. And so this could be the case if you're suffering with harm OCD, yet you work in a kitchen full of knives, or if you work in a school setting and you're suffering with POCD, perhaps going to work feels like the most terrifying thing in the world if it's a particularly bad time. So it's really interesting how OCD kind of like either thrives on the work environment or really um, helps, like leads us to want to avoid. And I'm also really interested in the fact that back when I was really, really ill, it didn't even occur to me for a second to talk about my mental health to my employer. I think that's because I just thought there was something very wrong with me. I had no idea I had OCD. I just thought that there was something wrong with me. So my whole life was built around avoiding any situation that would trigger me. And so work presented a brilliant environment for that. I could just be in the office. I knew what would happen. I knew what I would see. I knew that I'd be in meetings and I just felt really safe there. And what got really bad with my job in corporate, I was working in an office, is I actually got told off by my boss once. He said, I really need you to take some days off, Jade. You've got like 20 days of annual leave here. By the way, if you're in the US, we have quite a high number of days off in comparison. So we get about 25 to 30 days annual leave a year. And I was leaving like 20 of them behind and really not going on a holiday or having breaks. And I actually remember also going into work on, bank holidays, and when the whole country was off, I would actually go to work convincing myself that there was important work to be done and that I really was needed there. And even on holiday, I would be like checking in on different things and calling the office to make sure everything was in hand, because it just gave me a bit of a sense of structure when everything else felt completely like it was falling apart. If you're currently doing this, this is not going to be a healthy long-term strategy. My experience with that is that it eventually caved in. My brain got to the point where it could not take any more. And so I ended up in a position where I had huge mental breakdowns at work, and people around me didn't have a clue what was going on because obviously I hadn't talked to them about my mental health. And so I remember really vividly that I travelled a lot. This is back in what year was this now? This was about 2013 when my OCD was extremely bad, and I had to go on a work trip. I had to fly, and I wasn't comfortable with traveling at all. I just didn't like the anxiety sensation. I'd have a lot of nausea. I would actually throw up the morning of a flight because I was so terrified and be dreading it for weeks on end. Now, my job at the time, I actually had to travel like 2 to 3 times a week across Europe. And so the night before, I would just be in pieces. And I remember one particular time I was going over to Germany to meet a colleague for a one-on-one meeting, and I was in the hotel, and I don't even remember what triggered me, but I ordered some dinner. I sat down to eat it. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but the sort of trigger bomb where you literally, your brain just goes, boom, you go into meltdown, you instantly feel sick. The whole world feels like it's closed in on you. The blood rushes out of your face. It feels like a dead weight is just plummeted to the bottom of your body. And I went to my room and I was shaking, and I was like violently ill for a couple of hours. And then I settled down a little bit, because after a severe panic attack, I would always find that my emotions would settle a little bit. And there was a 1% wave of relief, but the intrusive thoughts and the anxiety would still be, absolutely riddled for a couple of days. Now, I rung my boss and said, I can't go to Germany. I've been sick. I've been unwell. And they were like, oh, this is happening a lot. Why are you always sick? You like, what's going on? They were kind of skeptical about me because I was a really hard worker, and I wasn't taking any leave off, but every time we traveled, I wouldn't want to have a drink in the evenings with colleagues. I'd be so anxious. I wouldn't want to go to restaurants. I'd drag myself, and I'd have I don't know, bruschetta with tomatoes, something really bland and simple, or plain spaghetti with tomato sauce or something like that. And they didn't understand or recognize this person, because back at the office in the UK, I was very outgoing. I was the leader of a team. I was really confident, happy, up for a drink on a night out. And they were just a bit like, what's wrong with you? It was almost like an energy of you're weird. And these are people that I love deeply, even to today. So this is in no way, a bad reflection of the employer. I hadn't even talked to them about my issues because I didn't know. I just thought all my fears were true and I was a bad person and that I was in denial and in hiding. So I drove myself home from the hotel attached to the airport at Heathrow that day. I didn't go to Germany, and I rescheduled the trip for the week later, and I just went back into hiding in my house and just recovered for 2 to 3 days, and then back to work and tried. Now, I never took a day off for my mental health condition. I think maybe that day I didn't go into the office. I just drove home and rested. What I find really interesting is that I read about OCD at work and the fact that people will take an average of a certain number of days off each year as a result of their OCD. And I'm like, oh, my chair's moving without me consenting. Let's go back again. That is so weird. Just moved. And I'm like, I really could have used some of those. I mean, I'm not about avoidance and laying in bed for 3 weeks when actually it would have been better for me to get to work and carry on. But I definitely could have benefited from a few sick days when I was in a really bad place, or even just to use my actual leave as rest days. But I just couldn't see the link between the two things. I just wanted to power through. I didn't want to be alone with my thoughts. The idea of resting was terrifying to me because that would mean, being alone with my thoughts. So that was my experience with it. And after that, with the Germany trip, it just got worse and worse and worse. And it got to the point where I couldn't really go anywhere for business meetings. And do you know what really hurts me is that job was the love of my life from a perspective of the career line that I'm in. And I reckon that I left it because of OCD without actually realizing. And that's a really hard thing to come to terms with, because what's interesting is the person that I left my job to when I hired, ready for me to leave, I look at where they are now within that company, and I think, oh, that's what you watch the progression. I'm like, oh, that would have been me if I hadn't been so terrified. All of that said, I'm really happy with where I've arrived in what I'm doing for work today. So it's really not good to look back and feel those types of feelings. But it only recently occurred to me that that is why I left. I'd given myself the story that because I'd been offered a smaller local company job with a promotion, it was like, that's a step up. It's near your house. There's not as much traveling. And I think now that we've had COVID times, it probably was too much traveling for anyone from a mental health point of view. So I'm sure that came into it. But I know that probably the person I am now would have actually enjoyed visiting all these different cities and getting out of the office more than I used to. So definitely a balance. And I think COVID, the pandemic, and more recent years, so even 2013, that's nearly a decade ago, I do think companies have moved on a long way since then. Now, something that really blows my mind is that obviously I didn't know I had OCD back then, and I was a manager at the time, and it just blows me away. This girl came to me for a meeting on the team, and she said, "Oh, Jade, I need to talk to you about something medical. My doctor's asked me to talk to you just to let you know the reason why I've been ringing you all the time out of hours, worrying about my work and asking you lots of questions, is that I've been diagnosed with OCD." And honestly, my brain was like, oh, she's really tidy and she's really worried about being neat and organized, and that doesn't sound like something difficult compared to what I'm going through in my head, because my head is like, I'd give anything to be her. And this is one of the reasons why I don't get mad or upset with people who don't understand OCD or know what it really is, because genuinely I had no clue what OCD was. And when she was describing things to me that she was going through, I was very professional, empathetic in the situation, but I don't think I quite grasped just how difficult it was. I think she talked to me about having a severe fear of nuts, because someone in her family had a very severe nut allergy, and she was fearful of contamination. And there had been this one incident which was horrifying, where some of the people in the care centre, in the call centre, had been like eating nuts and then like throwing them at her desk, like jokingly, to tease her. And at the time, I was like, obviously we followed through with that, because it's just not appropriate to do something like that when someone is clearly saying they're distressed about it. And I remember supporting that individual and informing HR as she had wanted me to, and making sure that we were aware of what this meant and what this disorder was and how she may need support. But I just can't believe that I didn't realise that I had it. And it's like, it's insane, because I didn't find out I had it for another 4 years, maybe 5 after that. And you just think, doesn't it point to such a lack of awareness of what OCD is, that someone could be sitting telling me they have it? And yeah, so today I'm not mad at people who don't know what OCD is. I take the opportunity to educate them when I can, if they're open to that. I was having a conversation with someone about the mental health training that they've received. And again, I felt like there was still a long way to go. They were a senior person who really respected how difficult it can be for people with mental health issues at work. But even just subtle undertones led me to feel that people do not get it unless they've had it. Like the amount of training this person had, and they still ended the conversation with, but it is a real pain for us, managing schedules and dealing with, what comes with having someone taking all these random days off. At least if they've got a broken leg, we know where they're up to and when it'll be fixed. But it's a real pain when someone's got a mental illness, because you just don't know when it's going to flare up next. And I think that they were describing someone with OCD because the traits were that they would say, I can't come to work today because I saw some scissors, and I'm really fearful of those from a suicide or harm point of view. And it wasn't that they were genuinely scared, genuinely suicidal. It was that they had OCD fears around these items. And so I really did empathize with this person, because their colleague was ringing them, 10 times a day to be like, are there any scissors on or near my desk? And they'd become extremely compulsive. Now, this person had been trained that in that situation, it's really important to direct them back to whichever therapist they work in and say, I really can't engage in this type of conversation. If you obviously need to work from home, that's really your call. But we can't keep having this same discussion. This is not going to help you. But again, it was just fascinating to hear their perspective, their view of like, why can't they just make peace with whatever they're scared of? Why can't they just come in and face it? It's not a big deal. And it was really interesting to listen to. So if it were me today and I knew what I know about OCD and I was on my recovery journey and maybe I was on medication, I think I would have informed my HR department, the people management department, to say, look, just for you to be aware, this is something that I live with. I'm really managing it myself, and I've got a therapist, and I've got a coach, or I've got medication. But here's some of the things that if I do get really unwell, maybe I'm going to need to take a day out, because I do think that sometimes that rest day is needed if it's been particularly bad. But we've also got to be careful, just this is just my own view, just got to be careful that we don't end up so bad that we completely draw back from work and sort of give in to the avoidance need and that feeling of urgency about avoiding situations, because that can really slowly box us in and really lead us to move away from all areas of life. Now, if your fears are in relation to making mistakes at work, I think in similar ways that my themes came up when I had children, I decided to see it as a really incredible opportunity to work on my recovery. I was like, wow, like this is going to be an exposure all day, every day. And this is actually in the long term going to really help me move forward. So if you can see work as part of recovery, like not, okay, I go to work, I come home, and then I work on recovery. If you can say to yourself, this presents a brilliant opportunity for me to move forward. So, for example, with unconditional self and life acceptance, making a mistake at work is going to latch if you're really fearful of that type of thing. And so, really working on making peace with the fact that people do make mistakes in life, and we want to work really hard in general not to go wrong at work, but we also need to accept ourselves that even if we did make a mistake at work, then we could accept ourselves anyway. And just looking at other people and how we would treat them. So, for example, my experience as a manager, if someone came to me with a pretty big mistake, my first reaction would be, okay, so let's look into how this happened. Let's look into a solution for what we're going to do going forward. And let's work out how we can put things in place for this not to happen again. And yeah, here's the consequences of that mistake. And here's what we're going to have to do if it's a very severe mistake in terms of disciplinary action. But that doesn't take away your value. We still care about you as an employee. We want to support you in whatever it is that led you to make this really big mistake. And there was never, just for me personally as a manager, there was never any I was never aggressive or hard on anybody unnecessarily or at all, because I firmly believe that that's never necessary. And so there are a lot of very bad managers out there, very poor managers in terms of behaviours, where they are not able to navigate difficult scenarios because they don't have the leadership skills. So if you are experiencing a poor management style from the people you work with, I think a big part of the journey is recognizing that that is on them, and there's areas for them to grow, because it's not okay for you to be treated poorly if you've made mistakes. You can accept their behaviors, but you don't necessarily have to agree with them. And if it happens long term, you could decide, this is not the place for me. I want to be treated with respect. And so I think making peace with that worst case scenario is like, and I know this sounds terrifying, but genuinely people do lose their jobs day in, day out, and then they can come out the other side with a new job. Maybe you work in a sector where it's pretty high severe consequences if there's a mistake made. I would imagine that that is bound to latch even harder. But for me, if that was me, I would be studying people who have gone wrong in those areas, and looking at them as a whole person, not only their mistake, and focusing on, yes, of course, I don't want that to happen, but I would like to have the reaction that someone without OCD would have to that scenario. Such as my best friend is a midwife. She has faced really difficult, challenging scenarios, and she'll say to me, oh yeah, I would hate for any mistake like that to happen, but she doesn't dwell on it. She knows it's a possibility. She knows that likely bad things are going to happen during her career, but she's not obsessing about it like we are. And we place a huge amount of stress upon ourselves when we over concern ourselves with it. And that's exactly why, for me, practicing unconditional self and life acceptance has helped loosen OCD's grip, because it helped me to have a more rational viewpoint on the feared scenarios. So, whatever's going on for you at work with OCD, I hope this has been useful for you. Please comment below if there's anything else you would like me to cover, any questions I can answer. Work is a really big part of our life, but it isn't all of us. So if you can really focus on seeing the parts of yourself that are outside of work, work is just part of our identity. So we can find, a fulfilling life outside of work. If you're finding yourself in the camp that I was in, where you're sort of in the more towards addiction to work and escapism through work and getting lost in your computer screen, I'd really encourage you to look at that and reduce those hours and take breaks, and be able to sit with the uncomfortableness of anxiety sensations. And if you're on the other side, where work is really a trigger for you and you find yourself naturally avoiding things, I would say, yeah, definitely try and build it into your recovery plan, whoever it is that you're working with, whether that be a coach or a therapist or peer support workers, whatever you're doing, or reading books and helping yourself, whatever it is that you're doing, trying to build in these mini exposures and not avoiding any situation because of OCD. All that does is tell your brain, yes, this is dangerous, I need to move away from this, and it just makes it grow. As you saw with me, the more that I avoided triggers, the more that I didn't want to travel, the more that I buried myself in work, I just eventually, my brain just went bang and I was wiped out. I really hope that wherever you are in the world, that mental health is on the agenda with your employer. And if it's not, I'm really sorry. It's not. That's just not nice, and it's not good. And I know that I'm very fortunate in the UK that we at least are having some form of understanding of mental illness. I think that there would have been a time in my life where medication would have helped me at work, because I do remember being in meetings and the overwhelming flood of anxiety being unbearable to the point where I had to run to the bathroom to be sick. I used to have this feeling of, we're sitting in this meeting and the door is closed and we have to sit here for 3 hours and I'm not in front of my computer and they're talking about stuff and I can't control my thoughts. And just reflecting on now, where I love doing workshops with clients or having meetings, it's amazing to think that I was so terrified of just sitting there and my thoughts being there. Um, so yeah, I guess anything that you've taken from today that's been valuable, I hope that it helps in a small way. And all the best with whatever work that it is you're doing. And I wish you a very good rest of your day. Thank you.